This podcast is brought to you by the Empowerment Project. Research proves that empowerment self-defense training makes you safer, period. I want you to have a great self-defense toolkit so you can create strong boundaries, speak with confidence, and take up all the space that you deserve in the world. We'll hear stories from survivors and find out what worked for them and why. We'll interview leaders in the field and talk about tips, concepts, and really easy things that you could do to make yourself safer and interrupt the cycle of violence. I've taught self-defense classes for over 30 years, and I promise to teach you everything I know. Ultimately, I'm going to want you to get some in-person training, but a great empowerment self-defense class is more than just the physical skills. The list of things I want to teach you is endless, so let's get to it. My name is Sylvia Smart, and welcome to the Empowerment Project. Hello, listeners, and welcome back. Ariel Estrada is my guest today. I have known him for so many years. Okay, wait, Ariel, how many years?
Oh, my goodness. I think since, if we want to put years to it, when did I first meet you? I guess I met you back in 1992. 1990.
1991.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a long time. I'm not doing the math. Anyone else who wants to do the math can. But anyway, we've known one another for many years. Ariel and I trained martial arts together, and we experienced the same kind of weird, abusive, cult-like dynamics simultaneously. And we both left and got out and cut ties independently of one another. But then we found our way back to friendship as we both started processing what happened years later, and it's been really great to reconnect. Ariel's trajectory, his journey, is very interesting through his childhood challenges and experiences with racism and abuse as an adult have given him a very unique perspective on healing and empowerment. A really cool thing about Ariel is that he's using his skills, his gifts, his talent to create healing for himself and for others through his artistry. It's really great to see and experience that. And that is why I wanted all of you to meet him today. So welcome, Ariel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sylvia, for inviting me to do this. This is a great honor to be part of this wonderful podcast.
Thank you. So I want to just jump right in. And can you talk with us a little bit about your childhood? I know you experienced, it was a very challenging relationship with your dad at the least, I think. Can you talk about what that looked and felt like? And do you have any specific stories you'd feel okay sharing with us? And of course, only what's comfortable.
Yes.
Cool.
Thank you. First, I do want to say that, I loved my dad. I love my mother. And that as parents, they did the absolute best that they could. We're first generation Filipino Americans. But I will also say that intergenerational trauma is a thing. Mm-hmm. And that the kind of traumas that my own parents went through, and thinking even what my grandfather and grandmother went through, and my grandfather on my mother's side was a World War II veteran who went through the death marches of all the Filipinos when Japan took over the Philippines. He barely survived that. He had part of his skull had to be removed because he got bashed in with a rifle. And then just sort of growing up in relative poverty in the Philippines. And both my father and my mother were really part of the American takeover of the Philippines after World War II, mm-hmm. right? Which had been historically, all the way back to the Filipino massacre, also known as the Filipino American War, where 1 million Filipinos died at the hands of Americans, a very little talked about war that no one talks about, but it was essentially a genocide of the Filipino people at the hands of the Americans. And that history still reverberates today, more than a century later, and certainly reverberated through my father. And because of it, my father ended up joining the military, Coast Guard specifically. He had his own very, very intense experiences with trauma, not the least of which was he was originally in the Philippine Air Force. His best friend was killed before his very eyes in a plane crash, and he was ordered to pick up what was left of his friend's body.
Oh,
Yeah. So terrible, terrible sort of trauma stories from trying to be, well, I guess what a man, basically. And that toxic masculinity was something that sort of reverberated through his life. And then, of course, ended up reverberating through mine.
right.
There was never any physical abuse, but there certainly was a lot of emotional abuse, and not because, boy, this is perhaps me just trying to justify my father's treatment of me, but I truly believe is that he did feel like it was the best thing for me, and then he did love me because he went through so much racism and so much discrimination, especially in the early 60s, late 50s, when he first got here to the States. He never wanted me to experience that, or any of his children to experience that. My mother too. And, there was a drive, not just from him, an internalized drive and an outward drive just from being in America itself and the white supremacy of the culture, to assimilate, to fit in as much as possible. And of course, here's my father's son, myself, who is the sensitive gay artist son that he had no idea what to do with at all. Sensitive gay artist son with asthma, and overweight, and probably overweight because I was armoring myself from all that pain that was going on. And also a very, very strong drive to succeed. Typical immigrant story, right? Just high drive to live better than what my parents experienced, and it, pair that with like a Catholic upbringing, and it's was a recipe for a lot of something that we call in the Filipino community, specifically by this wonderful Filipino scholar named E.J.R. David in his book Brown Skin, White Minds, post-colonial psychology, or the colonialized mind, right? That an automatic assumption that we are less than, and therefore should work harder, right? And then, of course, there's no amount of work that you can do to be better or as good as white people. You will forever be less than. And so you just keep working harder, and you become more and more dejected and more unhealthy and more full of self-hatred and self-loathing. That reflects in many Asian cultures, Filipino certainly, but other cultures as well, in something called white worship. My friend Susan Liu, she's a wonderful artist based out of Seattle, has a fantastic solo show called 140 Pounds about the death of her mother. And her mother died on the operating table with a quack plastic surgeon. Quack plastic surgeon, because she was so desperate to sort of adhere to what white standards of beauty are, including skin lightening. I believe she was doing a nose job that day to try to make her nose look more white, and some other things I think that day, and died on the operating table. And the story is about Susan's journey to try and heal from that, and also understand what happened and see justice done. But she couldn't, because the plastic surgeon died by the time she found him. So had already been dead for many years. So she had to figure out how to heal from that without having a cathartic experience of seeing justice done. And in the meantime, learning about her own colonialized mind and how we are trained as people of color, as people of the global majority, to hate ourselves. And the things that we do to either make that pain either go away or encourage it, because on some level we feel we deserve it.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're talking about is it's so complicated to unpack it all, because not only is there the generational trauma, which we know studies are showing that generational trauma passes down over 17 generations, which means we're all carrying some type of baggage. So there's that, but there's this, I love the way that you talk about this colonial mindset and what it means to be colonized, because that is also huge for a lot of people around the globe, everywhere. And so those are things that are really important to discuss and to have awareness around. And then you're looking at how your dad was impacted by all that stuff, your mom and your dad, and how that specifically got passed down to you. And this is your healing journey to begin, you like to do this work of not just feeling the feelings, but reading about it, understanding it, researching it, talking to other people. And it's like one of the reasons why I really wanted so much to have you on this podcast, because you've got such a dynamic perspective. And I want to keep going, and I want to talk about how we know that once a person experiences abuse, particularly sexual assault or some type of trauma, that when we're talking about sexual assault, so for my listeners who have experienced sexual assault, we know that begets future sexual assault, and that abuse, if I grew up feeling abused, feeling less than, feeling like it was okay to receive emotional, psychological assaults to my person, then I become desensitized and I don't know another way. It starts to feel familiar. So I start to seek that in my other relationships or replay it. And so this is my lead in to asking you about your experience with martial arts training. And because we both had that connection with our martial arts training, and I want to know, like, initially, like, what led you to training martial arts? What was that about, that decision to look for that and find it?
It's fascinating to hear you speak about how abuse begets abuse, because, unlike, I did not have, luckily, I did not have an inciting event. Say I was not sexually assaulted or I was not physically assaulted. But I would argue that to be a person of the global majority, a person of color in this country, any given one, is sort of this experience of having low-grade abuse all the time in the form of microaggressions, microinvalidations, right? And and specifically for the Asian community, sort of lack of representation, and never seeing yourself really. I don't ever recall seeing myself other than possibly Bruce Lee on TV or film, or represented in any sort of mainstream media, except as stereotypes, right? Except as the most extreme and offensive of stereotypes. You definitely couldn't get it. Well, I would love to say that you couldn't get away with it now, but unfortunately, it definitely gets away with it a lot. People, the mainstream media gets away with it often.
Still,
often, yeah. And despite the fact that things have gotten better, they still get away with it often, right? Because it's we start getting into sort of concept of white supremacy and also capitalism, right? So one of the things that gets supported in capitalism is who spends the most money and who is most wealthy and who has access to that money, right? Which is typically white people. And because of that access, they get to be the winners, as the saying goes, right? And they get to control the narrative, and they get to see how we get seen. right? And because of it, it's a death by 1,000 cuts
Right.
for any person of color. And speaking again back to that colonialized mind and colonialized mindset, that if that feeling of being discounted, of being made to feel unimportant, and in the case of Asian men in particular, and double so because I knew I was a gay kid, I knew I was different, even at a very young age, to have that reinforced constantly, and combine that with, and this begins to become very intersectional, of course, right, where both my as a very well-meaning acting teacher once said, but it was really kind of weird and offensive, multiple minority status, right? Not a particularly great way to phrase that.
Right.
But because of both of those things, of feeling less than because I was gay, feeling less than because I was brown, right? This sort of constant feeling that I literally wished that I were anything but Filipino, anything that brown, and just to say it, that I really wished that I was white, and constantly wishing that I was white, and knowing that it couldn't be true.
Yeah.
Right. But still trying, knowing that if I just worked hard enough, I would somehow succeed. But this society is set up so you don't. Right. So this kind of abuse, that kind of, I guess, desensitization, as you say, right? But also extremely sensitive to it. Like, how can I be liked? This intense need to be liked and to be accepted, right? Which I think is true of a lot of actors and artists. But there's an old joke about theater actors about who hurt you, because you're a brilliant actor, right? You're a brilliant artist. Who hurt you? You can't be this good without. Well, I wish that. I think that's kind of bullcrap, but but I will say that actually all led to me wanting to do martial arts. I originally started in Taekwondo. I was a very, very fat and unhealthy kid, and and I'm sorry for using fat-phobic language in there. I guess I was big, I guess is the way to describe it, and that I just wanted to improve myself and make myself better by any means necessary. At first, I started in Taekwondo, and then one of our old training partners, we were in a show together at our old college, and where he was performing in it as one of the movers, because he did Buklan, or he did martial arts with us, and he handed me a free month card, and when I walked in that door to the school, there was a picture there in the hallway of someone that we trained with, one of the black belts. And the receptionist, I asked her, "Who is this?" And she flat out told me that this was one of their black belts. And we're all very sad because he's dying of AIDS. This, of course, was the height of the AIDS crisis. I was still very young at that point, but there was, I didn't know, because we weren't in New York at the time. People were dropping dead everywhere at that point.
Yeah.
Just people, like young men at their prime, just dying, dropping dead. And I knew that I was in the right place at that moment. I literally fell in love with the place at that second, because I knew I was gay. I had not really come out to my parents yet. I was still it was still very dangerous to be gay at that point. I mean, it's still dangerous to be gay, but I'm here in New York now, and it's relatively common to be gay around here and accepted here. We always forget that to be gay in other parts of the world is still very dangerous.
Right.
And back then it was absolutely a dangerous thing to be known as gay or to be out. Right. So I had a hard time coming out, and I knew that I'd be safe there. And there was also this weird thing that I used to joke about, but I still sort of feel that way, that, oh, if this is the stereotype of Asian men that we all just do martial arts, well, I'm going to lean into it. And he said, I'm going to lean into it and be a damn good martial artist, and I'm going to be hot. Right. Although I didn't realize that till later, because even back then it's like just terrified of intimacy, terrified of being near people. Yeah. Right. And so I wanted to sort of beat myself into submission, honestly. And I found this weird place where not only could I feel safe, but also be beaten into submission, because that's all I deserved. Right.
Right. You step into this, like, it makes so much sense. You step into this hierarchical system where you're never going to meet, like, you're never going to be the best, and you're always going to need to be better than you were yesterday, and constantly shown how you're not good enough yet in this particular, school and style.
Yes. So and you're always you're always lambasted for, like, watch your ego, right? When really your ego was probably something that was trying to protect you from something that was really bad.
Right. So go ahead. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, I'm just laughing at it because it just seems so absurd, right? In retrospect, with the hindsight, right? I guess, of age, right? And that it's something that certainly wouldn't fool me now. I wish I could say it wouldn't fool me now, but it was, again, it's a familiar feeling that it's something I have to watch myself all the time about. Right.
Right.
And that that itself is a form of what we all call hypervigilance. Right. Yeah. And that it is a consequence of that kind of heavy training and that kind of trauma, honestly, right? And sometimes I wonder if I'm replacing one form of hypervigilance for another, right? And like, where are these patterns replicating themselves? And I do have the wisdom of age now to be able to go, this sure feels familiar. Maybe I should think of a different way. But of course, back then I was young and
we didn't know.
Had no idea.
No, we didn't know another way. And like, I think that's something you and I shared in common, which is this familiarity with that, like never being good enough, always needing to be better, to try harder, to, never seen. Like all those things I think we had in common. And we often talk about the irony of there we are training this very physical, fierce, fighting martial arts style pukulan from Indonesia in this, school where we're being told over and over and over again that this is about your empowerment, but yet at the same time, our power, whenever we attempt to speak it or say something's wrong here, or this doesn't feel right, or this is too much for me, or I have an injury, I can't do that today, right? That power, that autonomy over our own body is often stripped away. Well, yes. If you were a good student, you would do what I say, right? And so that hierarchy comes in, and it's just so ironic because it's supposed to be about empowerment, and it is in so many ways. And yet at that same time, in this particular piece of that system, it's the opposite of that. And it feels comfortable to you and me because it's what we've grown up with in some ways.
Yeah, I honestly felt like that they were really trying to help me. And there's another there's another thing that sort of does exactly what Pukulan did in a microcosm, which was also sort of systems of white supremacy as well. And that this felt so familiar because this was something that I was undergoing all the time, just existing as a brown person and a gay person, a brown person in a white world and a gay person in a very, very straight world, especially back then. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was, just that what was most similar to me was what you were just saying about how, you're resistant to the training, right? If like you're, that your ego is getting in the way. Why are you resisting? And it reminds me actually of things that I went through in acting school too, right? There's a real push right now in the theater world to decolonialize theater training. And to be expected, white folks are pushing back very hard against it, which is to be expected, I suppose. But part of what's so rough about theater training is that it's so unhealthy and unsafe for both gay people and people of color. And also if you are a different body type, if you are, they really shame you if you are overweight, right? And I just have horror stories about acting school and things that are still done in acting school to people of color, to people if you're overweight, to women. It's just awful. But you get that same thing about your ego, right? You're just resisting. Just imagine what it's like in these programs to say you are resisting the training. You need to be open. You need to be open to the training. This sounds so similar to what we experienced at Pukalan. You need to accept the fact that you can tell your story, right? You're telling this to a person of color. You're telling this person to a gay person who have done nothing but have to protect themselves their entire lives, and then tell a room full of white people your story.
Right.
It's, rude for one thing, and colonial beyond belief. And this is all to say that even after, it wasn't just Pukalan where I replicated these systems. It was in every single part of my life that I replicated some sort of really, really dysfunctional culty behavior.
Yeah. Right. And exactly, because this culty behavior is not solely seen in a hierarchy of Pukalan, Chimindi, Tulan, but it's also seen in religions and in, other organizations, like all over the place. Scientology, for example, like it's everywhere, right? And they look for people who feel comfortable with that type of behavior, those types of rules, that type of crushing, fake, oh, we love you, come here for empowerment. There is this sense of vigilance that we need to have as we enter into these organizations. But I want to bring something back, which is what for you. So you grow up in this particular, very interesting family, which has all sorts of complex issues going on. You get involved in this martial art, and some of these things are replicated. And what were some early signs for you? Because this is self-defense, right? What were some early signs for you that something wasn't right? And how did that land for you? Did you notice it in your body, or how did that come to you that there's something going on here that makes me really uncomfortable? You know what I'm asking?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
absolutely. And it's, wow. Again, I'm gonna preface this by saying when we started this, we were so young, and I was 20. I started when I was 20, right? Absolute baby, and I didn't know. I grew up in a small town in Sitka, Alaska, right? I had barely been exposed to anything about life, right? And I guess, looking back, there were plenty of signs, but I didn't see them because I just thought, oh, this is really cool. It's so, and back then you were 20 years old. You can pretty much heal from anything. Even, and I sort of reveled in the fact that I was literally attending school full time and then going to train at night or going to do a show, to rehearse for a show, and then that weekend train for 6 hours straight, and then be constantly training, running, doing all these things that sort of like that I didn't realize then were basically abusing my body, and sort of leaning into the self-abuse of it, and it felt good. It felt good to hurt myself like that. It felt good because look what I'm getting. I'm finally seeing a six pack, or I'm finally sort of feeling good about my body. Although I never felt good about my body.
Yeah.
I always thought that I was too fat. I always thought I was too fat and that I wasn't good enough, right? And so therefore I had to train harder. I had to run that extra mile in the morning or do the more push-ups at night before I went to bed, right? Just sort of driving my body into the ground. And in retrospect, of course, that wasn't right. That was horrible. I guess I didn't really start feeling that things weren't right until we actually opened the New York school here. There was a school here in New York that I was deeply involved in. And for those 10 years that I was training on and off because I'd moved to New York from Seattle. I wasn't near a Pukulan school, except for, and I didn't have a relationship with any of the schools that were that were further north, relatively nearby, but I didn't know anybody there, so I didn't go. I didn't know that I could go. And so I started a program or just a small class in the Lower East Side way back when. I don't even remember the year now, about 15 years ago now. And all of a sudden there were 20, 30 people in the class. And I really wasn't teaching it in the way that I had been taught to teach it, because it was at that point, I was 30, early 30s at that point, mid 30s. And I'd already started to realize that like the way that this was being taught was really weird, that at least that I'd learned there in the original school that we trained at. That very, very harsh militaristic style. I'd also started cross-training and doing training with some other martial artists and that were from the feminist martial arts community, right, who also deeply influenced the training and made it much more sort of egalitarian, democratic, and that you can train hard, but also train lovingly without abusing yourself, basically. And I began to sort of get this sort of very deep like inklings of understanding about that something was wrong. And then eventually headquarters found out that I was doing this class, and that it was being relatively successful here, and sent somebody to took it. Well, I wouldn't say sent, but it sort of felt that way. They basically took it over. And in the process of taking it over, and I was at that point too, I was just, I was really lost. I wasn't really succeeding very well in my acting career. And there was something that there were no mentors then in the Asian community that at least I could draw from, right? And that would tell me, that's like, look, this is something that every young man goes through. You're too young to play a dad and you're too old to play a college student. Like that this is a pattern as an artist, that you have downtimes, right? And I just automatically assumed, because of my own trauma, that I guess I'm not good enough, and that I had failed, right? And I had sort of already dove into martial arts training at that point. Partly too because I was also coming into my own power. Like the AIDS crisis had started to become a manageable disease, at least if you have insurance and have access, which unfortunately the Black community to a great extent still does not. And, I had sort of come into my own power sexually as well, right? I was in New York City. I was a relatively good-looking guy and who was training martial arts all the time. So, I was having fun in New York. And it became very, very seductive to dive into helping run the Pukulan school here.
Yeah.
But the very first inkling that things were wrong was that I was asked to basically take all this other knowledge that I had gained. I had created a program, a self-defense program for the LGBTQIA plus community with some of my other martial artist friends. And I was asked to take that information without giving them credit and claim it as our own. And I was also asked to not be friends with them anymore. Actually, that was not it. It was I was asked not to train in anything else except for Pukalan anymore, and that combined with the self-defense program, it was my first inkling that something was terrible, and then there were others over the years.
We have shared some of those together, and what would right. So for years you're going along, you're doing your best to start this really cool program. They send a white man to take it over.
Yep.
And tell you that you haven't been doing it right and you need to do it in this insular way, that only what we do is good enough, which
only we're
we
right.
all were told. Yep, we were all told that.
This was my favorite one. There's something else. There's something wrong with the way everybody else trains.
I know.
Ugh.
I know. I know.
Even saying it makes me sick to my stomach.
I know, because it's not true. But it was the line that we were fed. And okay. So for years you're being told these things. When did you finally decide to leave? Like, what was the impetus for that, or the final straw? How did you do it? How did you get out?
Wow. I mean, that was actually a multi-step process.
Yeah, right. And we're talking years of you putting up with and hearing these odd things.
Yes.
And seeing things that are making you feel uncomfortable.
Yes, and experiencing it myself, right?
Yeah.
Just being completely taken advantage of used, right? Because I was at that point, and still am, was a graphic designer, and I was starting to become quite good at marketing. Right. And that, of course, this totally fed into my own trauma. Right. I'm only good for what I can do. Right. I used to love the book Cider House Rules because that was one of the themes of the book. Right. That these about a whole group of people who were traumatized and that they only valued themselves for what they can do, not who they are in the world or how they be, but what they can do. Right. Yeah. And this, of course, appealed to me at that point because I didn't feel like I was valued as an actor, that I'd failed, and that this is the only way that I can possibly do any good in the world was through this school, and that I was basically a failure, and this is what I had to put up with, and this is my payment for being such a terrible human being. Right. This was all going through my head at any given time when I was with the New York school.
Right.
And that was in my head when the owner of that school, the New York school, called me in one day. I was at work. And of course, I was told, Mas Ariel, I need you. Can you come down to the school? Right. And of course, I dropped everything. I was at work, for God's sake. What couldn't wait until the end of the day when I wouldn't possibly risk my job to go down to the school? But I dropped everything, said that I had an emergency and went down to the school. And then I was sort of told that the best way there's no way to describe this other than just say the story, which was that one of the things that was done in the way that Pukalan was trained is that we basically had it as a given that the grandmaster of the system still had a relationship from beyond the grave with the dead originator of the system, that they spoke spiritually together through various means, often a Ouija board, and that the head of the school, the New York school, asked me, "What are you doing with the Grandmaster now?" And I go, "Well, Grandmaster spoke to Mr. Grandmaster I guess is the only way I could describe it. I'm translating
the dead
the
grandmaster.
dead grandmaster. There we go. That's better. There we go. I'm trying to translate all the weird Indonesian into weird Indonesian.
Right.
Boy, that was not a good way to describe it. But all the bahasa into English. But I guess the dead grandmaster is better. And said, oh well, a dead grandmaster said that I had this project that I should get done. And to which the New York head of the school said, Ariel, people don't speak to the dead. And I was so confused. I was also panicky. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. And that I was sort of risking sort of like the only thing that would be my sort of, I guess, salvation, or not salvation, penance. The only thing that was working as my penance, right? Because even at that point, I was thinking, God, what the hell am I in New York for? I'm not acting. I'm barely doing what I got a friggin' MFA in acting to do. I'm not doing any of this stuff. I was miserable. I'll tell you right now, I was miserable. I did not know I was miserable because I was so deeply involved in what was going on that I used it to not feel. I literally used it to not feel, right? And there were other ways later on after Pukalan that I used to not feel. I really, really was having a huge problem with alcohol for a while. Still do a little bit. That's something I'll have to face at some point. I have a huge problem with food, right? And overeating or undereating, right? And that these things, that all of a sudden I didn't know that was what I was feeling at the time, but I was feeling panic for losing the thing that I could use to punish myself, right? And weirdly, also deep down at the same time, there was an odd sense of relief because I had been just suppressing and telling that voice to shut up, that something was weird, something was wrong. What is wrong here? And I would always have this inner voice would go like, what the hell is going on with your ego, you egotistical piece of shit? What is going on? Why are you resisting this? You're just resistant. That's just your ego. What is wrong with you? Literally, that would be the voice in my head anytime I felt like something was wrong.
Right. You had internalized that voice.
It was really stuck in there. And I wish I could say that I felt clear and free afterwards, but it wasn't. The odd thing that did make it feel clear and free, or start to feel clear and free, was a few months later, my dad died unexpectedly. Just his heart exploded. If there's and he had an aneurysm. If there was ever a metaphor for my father's life, it would be that. He died doing something that he loved so much. They were out in a remote island out near where I lived, because I live in Southeast Alaska, and it's a gorgeous island community, right? And tons of fishing, and people take their Boston whalers out all the time in the summertime, go fishing and go explore the remote islands out there, also hunt deer in the winter. My dad loved it, right? Beautiful summer's day, and his heart exploded. And that moment that was the beginning of sort of my journey to realize just how much my dad loved me, but also how much I loved my dad, and that he did the very best he could. And the things that I went through with him, the things that were not pleasant, right? He did the best he could, especially with the way that we understand racism and the way that we understand racism works now and white supremacy works. They didn't talk about this stuff back then. I mean, my dad wasn't also, like me, an angry Asian man. But he didn't know how to channel that anger. He didn't really know what that was. We weren't talking about it as deeply then, right? And also, he also gave into sort of like this sort of a very American dream of, if I just work harder, I'll succeed. And he did after a fashion, right? But he just he would constantly complain about, then I didn't remember any of this stuff until after he died, but he would constantly complain about, like, I'm being passed over at work. I was a teenager, so I didn't even really hear being passed over at work for some white person who with less experience.
Yeah.
Right. And all those things where it was clear racism going on that he just sort of internalized and did what he could. But because he wasn't from here, he also didn't internalize it the way that his son did. Right. He internalized it in a very different way.
Right.
Right. And he also didn't buy it. I knew that he didn't buy into sort of, he was very bitter about the American dream, at least by the time he died, actually, that like, there's something wrong here.
Mm-hmm.
But he died too young to really sort of process it out. Funnily enough, my mother has really sort of figured it out because she's had more time to figure it out.
Right.
And that was sort of the final straw. There was some other stuff that went on. There were some really abusive other abusive people in the New York school, including a very self-hating gay man who did not like other gay men and made sure that I got kicked out, or made sure that the circumstances were ripe that I would either want to leave or get kicked out. Finally, I just said, this is ridiculous. I asked to basically just have a conversation with the head of the New York school. And this is, of course, was after the other gay man in the organization. This taught me a real lesson, actually, about how gay self-hatred will end up reflecting in other gay men treating each other like with as much toxic masculinity as straight men treat everyone, basically, or many straight men treat everyone. And that basically I asked, can we process this, please? What is going on? And then I was told that I was crazy, that I was mentally ill, and that I would not, that the head of the New York school would not ever speak to me, and that I bet you're just using this as an excuse to go back to Pukalan. And at that point, the school was still trying to run. It didn't live long past leaving the headquarters, actually, because it was also 2008. The financial crisis had really wiped out business after business after business in New York, including that school eventually. And I realized, you don't respect me. You've never respected me. This is ridiculous. Goodbye.
Goodbye. But, we're in this system where it's very rank oriented. So if you're trying to come to some sort of an adult conversation with someone who really sees that they have power over you, it in this particular system at that particular time, it just did not work to actually have adult to adult. And then I just want to give the context of this for our listeners is not only that, but we're also fighting each other. Like we're physically fighting. So you're putting yourself in this position where at Black Belt, we don't wear protective gear, right?
Mm-mm.
We could and did bash one another around. And part of that was really fun. And I know that you'll agree with me on that.
It's really fun.
We wouldn't have stayed as long as we did. But
especially when you got good at it, right? Because it's like you got less bashed.
Less bashed. But so you're in this strange system where you want to have this sense of safety because you're literally working with people in this dangerous setting and you want to know that you can trust one another, but yet there's this hierarchy of power and it's hard to have these discussions adult to adult.
Because people were abusing this power.
Yes, because of the abusive ego stuff that was going on and was allowed to go on. But what's really cool to me about your story is you have this upbringing, you have this young adult into adulthood looking at and finding ways to replicate that and that feels really comfortable. And at the same time, you're like, this doesn't feel right. And that story is common amongst a lot of people. At the same time that your perspective is very particular to you in some ways as well. But I love this journey that you've been on, because there are so many different ways to heal from these experiences that we've had in our lives. There's therapy, there are 12-step programs, there's, community connections, there's writing there. Like, there are so many different ways of healing, and your journey is so creative. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about Full Contact, what it is, how this has come to be, how it's contributed to your healing process, and kind of where you're at with it all.
Sure.
Big question.
Yeah, huge question. I am, first thing I want to say is, like, I sort of still feel like I'm in this continuous process of leaving of it, because one of the things that I've sort of discovered in the creation of Full Contact, which is my solo play, that I am about to go back into another writing workshop for it to do more development. I've been working on the show for about 4 years, 3-4 years, because it's really hard to write this play, because I have to keep sort of re-traumatizing myself every time I go back to some of these things, right? And I'm to the point now where it's like, oh, this is actually getting fun now, because I'm getting to a really close point in it. I'm getting some recognition for the work. The play was a finalist for the National New Play Network Commission grant last year, which thank you so much. I ended up losing out to a playwright friend of mine who is brilliant. So there's no loss there's no shame in losing out to this particular playwright, because he's so good. But I was also asked by that same organization to please resubmit that next year when we're not in COVID. Yes, good. When we're not in COVID. So. And it's interesting, the journey to even getting to the point of where I could write the play, right? Because I just kept on. I wish I could say that I was free and clear from Pukalan after that moment when I said goodbye, but I ended up continuing to replicate those experiences over and over again, including in of all things, a barbershop chorus, which sadly, a lot of choruses, unfortunately, because they're community-based organizations, replicate that kind of very, very horrendous cult-like experience, right? Because it's a community. There's often a very, very talented musician leading it. And they just sort of ask unreasonable things of you that they shouldn't be asking anyone, especially somebody in a community chorus, for God's sake. Right. And I replicated it in my relationships, dating endless, racist white guys, right? Mm-hmm. who would sort of, and finally it was the last straw with my last relationship. I dated an open racist, but I stuck around for a while because he supposedly treated me well, with trips to Paris and whatnot. I would have traded every single one of those trips for him to just acknowledge that, oh, I am so sorry you were followed in a store for no reason except that you were brown, which happens to me constantly. I could be wearing a suit, my best suit, and I would still be followed in the store. If I'm the only person of color in the store, I will be followed. And because it's assumed I'm going to steal something.
Yeah.
And that, just to have had that ex of mine acknowledge that, I would have traded every single trip we went on. And then things really came to a head right before the pandemic and the racial, it was 2019 and the racial environment in the United States was just about to reach its fever pitch, right? And then completely explode when the pandemic came, and when George Floyd was murdered.
Yeah.
Right. So and he basically said, it's just too negative dating you. I don't want to deal with your negativity anymore. And by negativity, it was because I was already doing a lot of work for anti-racism initiatives. At that point, it was mostly for Asian because the George Floyd's murder hadn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I was becoming very, very much more strident because it was we already could see my activist friends and I could already see the writing on the wall with all the anti-Asian rhetoric that was even coming out in 2019, that we were in trouble, and is already doing a lot of work at that point. But he called that negative. And I finally just said, look, I will. And when he said that I was negative and that he wanted to break up, and I'm like, great, I'm never going to stop.
Excellent. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah, I'm never going to stop fighting. See yourself out. I'm going to finish my glass of champagne that I have up here, up on my roof, in my apartment. But oh gosh, Full Contact. That was all part of that journey, right? And I finally decided I needed to start writing about it. But I took long breaks in between development pieces of it because, one, it was just, being an actor in New York is very, very busy. Actor and producer in New York is an extremely daunting task. But also it's because it'd take me a while to heal from that. I began to realize, oh my God, how do playwrights do this? Because they too sort of dig up everything that they've been through and put them in these plays. And I just had to take lots of long breaks in between because it was just remembering all that stuff was so hard.
So hard, so painful.
Yeah. And
really beautiful. Can I just jump in really quick? One of the really cool things about Full Contact that I particularly love is the way that you weave so many pieces of yourself into it, like your experience of racism, the history of the Philippines, your experience in the martial arts, your dad, like all these things are just beautifully connecting in this very creative piece.
Thank you. And it, like you said, yeah, it is basically, at its heart, it's basically a love letter to my dad.
Mm-hmm.
But also, not letting him off the hook for some of the things that he went through, but also to understanding that some of that was not his fault. He was just as beholden to white supremacy. He was just as beholden to the forces of heteronormativity, right? The forces of Catholicism and colonialism and all the things I've been talking about all hour. He was just as beholden to it as I am. And he responded in the only way that he could, that he knew how to do, right? As a military man, right? And as such, this is also sort of a love letter to myself. Not so much a love letter, but a forgiveness letter.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, look, you did your best too.
Yeah.
You really tried. And you fell into this cult, because that was the original question I had when writing this play, right? And you summarized it beautifully. It was that it is basically interweaves my father's immigration story and my own story, living through this cult experience, using it as a way to protect myself from the pain of being in this very racist society, the pain of being in this world where I could not touch anyone because you could die from touching someone, right? And how I fell into this cult because of that. Because my first question with Full Contact, with this hour-long solo show that interweaves animation, and I'm probably going to put some puppetry in it because I'm also a puppeteer. I don't know if you know that about me.
I didn't know that.
Because I got, one of the many other Indonesian and Malaysian and Southeast Asian things that I got into during Pukulan was also doing wayang kulit, doing Indonesian puppetry. But then I also learned how to do TV puppetry and full body puppetry and all that fun stuff.
Wow.
So I'm probably going to incorporate that somehow. I'd love to do some sort of shadow puppetry in there, particularly about the story of Pukulan. I think that would be a great great spot for it.
Really
actually.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But sorry, he's watching me create right now. Or you're listening to me create right now. In like, ooh, that would be a good idea. Let's try it.
Yeah.
But basically, it was me asking the question, how the hell did I get involved in this? Because I was very, very, at that point, I was very, very not forgiving of myself. Again, I was sort of reflecting my own trauma back at myself. Like, I must have not been good enough. I must have been an idiot. I must have been all these horrible things because I let myself fall into this terrible situation. But then so did a lot of people, right? And so do a lot of people in other cults, right? It's, I have a line in the play about how falling into cults is a pervasive experience that literally millions of people, millions of Americans go through, and that it's a pervasive health crisis, mental health crisis in the country, and that we don't do anything about it. We don't do a thing about it.
Well, we have to acknowledge it first.
Yeah. And but I have to say, it is, I'm still trying to figure out the ending of this thing because the ending keeps changing. You asked me, I think, in some of our preparation for this piece about how it's been healing. It's been absolutely healing to be able to get this story out. I literally could feel a weight lifted off my shoulders. I literally started to lose weight. I literally slept better.
Sigh of relief,
Yeah.
like just letting it go. And that whole piece that you said about self-forgiveness and, understanding your dad was doing the best that he can. And I love how you connect that to understanding your younger self who was doing the best that he could. Like that is healing, just that acknowledgement as well. Oh,
and
man.
I keep talking about how the ending's changing is because we're in a very terrible place for the AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander community. And I just want to say the disclaimer that I know that the term AAPI does not encompass the full lived experiences of Asians and Asian Americans in this country. It's the best term we've got right now, so I'm using it.
Yeah. Right, but that'll change too.
Yep.
And that's okay. Yep.
But it's a terrible time right now for us.
Yeah.
For a while, for a long time, I've tried to forget. I tried to do the one of my favorite film directors is Pedro Almodovar. And all of his oeuvre in his films is he creates his films in a parallel universe where Franco never happened. Right. And so for the longest time, I literally took that same attitude that I am going to live my life as if Pukalan never happened. And that I would actively try to forget it. And of course I couldn't. It's so deep in my body, and I couldn't forget it ever. But not just in my body, but in my psyche, because it's so, I'm not even sure if I want to forget it now, because having that trauma, if there's I'm happy and glad for the lessons that I've learned from it. I don't think I would have learned them without that trauma, but that becomes dangerously close to some other things that I wouldn't say blaming the victim, but there's another term for it. Maybe you know it, but trying to justify the behavior of the abusers or somehow.
Yeah.
So I don't even like to describe it that way because, it was horrible and I shouldn't have gone through it, but I did. So how do I make the best of it?
Right. And I think that is the healing journey. And, the more I read, the more I experience, I'm a little bit older than you, but trying to push away feelings, trying to actively forget things that you did or did not do, those types of dealings with our own internal selves and our own experiences and our own lives doesn't work. It never works because those feelings will be there. They don't go away until you look at them, feel them, acknowledge them, and do cool things with them, like creative stuff, or, find outlets or talk about it or write about it, or, go to therapy and engage in a therapeutic group, or like that's how we move past that, not by pretending they're not there. That does not work. At 61, I'm going to tell you that does not work. And literature and research and people who have had experiences will all tell you, like, you got to go through it. It's the only way.
Yep.
And Ariel, you are moving through it in a really beautiful way. So with this cool piece. And what I want to ask you is, if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to watch your show or find Leviathan Labs, which is your baby, how do they do that? I'm going to put links in the episode description, or, hashtags or your handles or whatever you want me to put in there, I will. But in the meantime, how can people find you?
Yes.
How can they watch your show?
Absolutely. First, I will say one more thing about the healing process.
Oh, yes, please.
Is that since the last time you saw the play, that was a video version of it, and I'll give the link in just a moment. But one thing, that there's been at least 3 instances in the last couple months since you saw it last, that there was some real terrible behavior on the part of some of people that I know, and that but because it was familiar, and because I'd gone through that process of writing the play, I have seen this before, and I knew how to deal with it, and I dealt with it in the moment, and I actually used my self-defense training at that exact moment. And at that moment, my self-defense training did what it was supposed to be doing all along and protected me.
Yeah, but it can't if you don't know. Like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you weren't like, oh, I see what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
And which is why it's so important to get it out and get through it, like you said. Mm-hmm. And people can find my work at www.Ariel Estrada, Ariel, like the Little Mermaid, and Estrada, ESTRADA.com. And please email me there. And if you're interested in seeing the show, I will send you a private link to the current version of the show, but it's going to change to a film.
And it's really good.
Thank you.
But yes.
It's a film version of the show because we had to do it in pandemic. And eventually this is going to be for a stage version, hopefully as soon as theater can come back in the early part of next year.
That's exciting.
Yeah. I cannot wait. Cannot wait to do it live. And you can also find out more about my theater company at leviathanlab.com, at LEVIATHAN lab, as in laboratory.com. Oh, I'm sorry, .org. Let me say that again so that can be edited. You can find more about Leviathan Lab, my theater company, at www.leviathanlab.org. And that's LEVIATHAN.org, O-R-G.
Got it. LeviathanLab.org.
Yeah.
Got it. And also, listeners, you can find links in the description of this episode. And you'll also, if you're a member of our Facebook group, the Empowerment Project Community, you will find links there as well. And if you want to join our group, we'd love to have you. Just find us, answer the questions, because if you don't answer the questions, we're not going to let you in, because it's a safe space. And if people aren't willing to answer our questions, they're very simple. It takes 2 seconds. Then we're thinking maybe they don't want to be here, or maybe we don't want them here. So yeah, the Empowerment Project Community, we'll have all the links there. Look in the episode description. You'll see all the links to Ariel and his work there. And gosh, thank you for spending this time with me. It's been really interesting. I've learned more about you, and I've had a really fun time talking with you about your life and your experience and your creative process. And thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, everyone.
it's affirmation time. This is how I end every self-defense class. It's kind of cheesy, but it's very cool, and this is how it works. We're going to do like a little call and response. If you can say this out loud, if you can repeat after me, do it, because it's important, I think, for you to hear your own voice. But if you can't, like if you're on a crowded subway or someplace where it's embarrassing, don't worry. You can also just say it inside your head. Okay, so I'm going to say something and you're going to repeat it after me. I'm going to give you space to do that. And at the end, we're going to say, yes. Here we go. Repeat after me. I am worth protecting. I love myself. I belong. I deserve to take up space on planet Earth. I am a strong and powerful person. Yes! Woohoo! And hey, as a wrap-up, will you do me a favor? Will you do all the things that you do when there's a podcast? Like, will you tell your friends? Will you subscribe? Will you come back each week, communicate with me, review this podcast? Like, all those things to help get more bandwidth, help more people find out about it. That would be super awesome. Take a deep breath. You are amazing. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.